Adoption tax credit, a part of the GOP tax code once on the chopping block, is saved in both the House and Senate. Texas church shooting. The Archbishop of San Antonio reacts after last week's deadly attack on a Baptist church. Nuclear disarmament. Pope Francis welcomes world officials to the Vatican to discuss the current tensions. We'll have a report from Rome. And breaking ground. An Ohio seminary is expanding due to an increase in seminarians. We'll find out why vocations are flourishing there. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, November 10th, 2017. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. On Capitol Hill, Republicans are making progress on one of President Trump's top priorities, the first major rewrite of the U.S. tax code in 3 decades. While some deductions will be eliminated, both versions retain an adoption tax credit. That credit had initially been cut from the House bill. We spoke to Representative Mike Kelly of Pennsylvania, a Catholic who worked with other pro-life leaders to keep the adoption credit.
Adoption as an option is something that we think just makes a huge difference, especially for those folks that are pro-choice people and are having a hard time making up their mind. My gosh, we give them that ability to go ahead and preserve life. It's the best thing I've been involved in my 7 years in Congress.
The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops are pleased with lawmakers for including the adoption tax credit, saying it aligns with their national priorities to protect life, strengthen families, and affirm the values of every human being. But they call it an incomplete solution. In a statement to EWTN News Nightly, the bishops point out one disadvantage. The bill would tax the money families get from employers when they adopt a child. The conference goes on to say, along with a number of other things that need to be fixed in the current bill that concern the poor and the lower income families, lawmakers should restore the Adoption Assistance Program exclusion. Kellyanne Conway praises the Republican tax plan. The counselor to the president spoke one-on-one yesterday with our White House correspondent, Mark Irons.
Tax cuts is the most important victory for the middle class of this country. That's who this is for. Should not be looked upon through a political lens, mainly because Americans just have not had tax relief in decades, literally, and they deserve it. The hardworking men and women who come home and they realize, gosh, I'm exhausted. I've worked so hard at my 1 or 2 or 3 jobs this week, and yet we have so little to show for it. Why is that? The answer is they pay so much in regulation, in user fees, in taxes, federal, local, and state. So at the federal level, we're trying to give them that much needed relief by lowering the percentage that they pay, by expanding the child care tax credit, by adding an adult dependent tax credit, by retaining many of those features that the middle class tell us they rely upon, home mortgage interest, for example, charitable contributions, 401k contributions, and allowing men and women in this country to have fatter wallets.
And Conway's boss is making headlines overseas. President Trump encounters Russian President Vladimir Putin during an economic summit in Vietnam, the latest stop on Trump's 5-nation Asian tour. White House correspondent Mark Irons is tracking the president's trip. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. President Trump focused on trade today, but his comments about North Korea and his appearance with Putin are hard to ignore.
Video shows President Trump and Vladimir Putin shaking hands and posing for pictures, but you won't see them sitting down for a formal meeting. The White House blames scheduling conflicts. The president wants Putin's help to stop the nuclear threat in North Korea.
The future of this region and its beautiful people must not be held hostage to a dictator's twisted fantasies of violent conquest and nuclear blackmail.
Trump also has tough talk for America's potential trading partners. He says the U.S. will not be taken advantage of anymore.
We must ensure that all play by the rules, which they do not right now.
Trump expressed his hesitancy to enter large multinational trade agreements like NAFTA and TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trump yanked the U.S. out of that deal. Now the remaining 11 countries seek a path forward without the U.S.
In the end, unfair trade undermines us all.
The president wraps up a week of visits to Japan, South Korea, China, and Vietnam, where he signed a special proclamation.
Commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War.
Meeting with U.S. war vets, including one who shares the president's goal.
We need to make America great again.
President Trump gets down to business after a series of elaborate ceremonies. He's scheduled to attend several more trade summits in the coming days. Wyatt?
Mark, 2/3 of the president's Asia trip has wrapped up at this point. What can we expect on the last leg?
Wyatt, the last country Trump will visit is the Philippines. He actually extended his trip to stay there a day longer. He plans to meet with President Rodrigo Duterte, who has had a rocky relationship with the U.S. since taking office in that predominantly Catholic country.
And I know the White House has called them out for human rights violations as well. White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. The White House says Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore should step aside if sexual misconduct claims against him are true. While on board Air Force One, Press Secretary Sarah Sanders told reporters the president believes if the allegations are true, Moore should and will do the right thing by removing his name from the race. A Washington Post report details Moore's alleged pursuit of sexual relationships with underage women. Moore denies the claims. A food pantry right next to the site of the worst mass shooting in Texas history reopens today. Volunteers at the pantry are organizing a blood drive and providing moral support for the community. But other signs exist that life may never return to normal in Sutherland Springs. The First Baptist Church building will be torn down. The pastor says it is, quote, too stark a reminder of the murders. Though the shooting occurred in a Baptist church, they're impacting the faithful of all denominations. Joining us now via Skype is Archbishop Gustavo Gosee, Assayer of the Archdiocese of San Antonio in Texas. Your Excellency, you're located about 30 to 35 miles from Sutherland Springs, where the church shooting occurred. How are you helping Texans cope with this tragedy?
We have a few parishes close by to the actual site, and so through the pastors, the laity in those communities, we're able to reach out to the people, families, or members of the community almost right away in some ways. And of course, we made available our services, like could be Catholic Charities, Catholic schools, and Catholic cemeteries.
After the shooting, there is concern about security in places of worship. How do you keep the faithful safe, and how does this tragedy impacted your policy, if it has at all?
Being sacred places, we need to figure out how we can be more attentive to things that happen and to help the people in the pew to understand that we'll need to be a little bit more careful and to really be aware of what is going on, to train maybe our ushers in a different way, and to find also some resources and people who have expertise on these matters.
Your Excellency, what advice do you have for the faithful in terms of healing spiritually after this shooting?
So prayer is of great importance because prayer moves hearts and changes minds and helps us to relate better with each other. So prayer. And then also to put a little bit of pressure of how we need to send more messages of peace, care, understanding, hope, instead of messages of violence, division, and causing harm or hurt.
Such important values that you listed there, and so important that people, not only in the Archdiocese, pray, but across the nation and across the world. Archbishop Gustavo Garcia, Assayer of the Archdiocese of San Antonio, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Catholic Charities in California is offering financial incentives to help secure housing for those left homeless by wildfires. The Santa Rosa Press-Democrat reports the Catholic Social Services Agency is giving $500 to anyone renting an extra room or dwelling to those displaced by the fires. Dozens remain in need of housing, and the county's last fire-related emergency shelter closed Tuesday. New drone footage in western Mosul shows the extent of the destruction the city has suffered under ISIS. Thousands of civilians were killed during the terror group's campaign. The video shows the city's hospital district. Iraqi forces pushed the militants out of the city after a grueling battle that ended in July. Prosecutors in the Philippines say government militiamen murdered an Italian priest in 2011, and 2 army commanders may have known ahead of time. The findings overturn an earlier report blaming the attack on 2 civilians. Father Fausto Tintorino was leading campaigns against mining operations in Manila when he was shot and killed. Pope Francis calls on global leaders to overcome their fears and to create a world without nuclear weapons.
Le armi di distruzione di massa, in particolare quelle atomiche.
The Holy Father addressed a two-day nuclear disarmament conference organized by the Vatican. The conference participants include Nobel Peace laureates, UN and NATO officials, plus diplomats from nuclear-armed nations.
知らなければ黙っていることでも、知ったからにはなんか話をしなければならない。
The conference also includes survivors like Masakato Wada, who was a toddler when the nuclear bomb was dropped on her hometown of Nagasaki, Japan. She now campaigns for an end to nuclear weapons. Juliette Lindley is EWTN News Nightly's Vatican correspondent. She joins us now from Rome. Juliette, why did the Vatican organize this conference, and how realistic are its goals?
Wyatt, this is the first major international gathering since July of this year, when 122 countries approved a new UN treaty calling for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, the point here is that none of the nuclear powers, no NATO member countries, signed the accord because they said it was unrealistic given the current state of affairs. But the moderator of the conference, Monsignor Silvano Maria Tomasi, told us he was well aware of the skepticism but said the goal was a long-term one.
Some people think that this new treaty is pie in the sky and not realistic enough to achieve something concrete. But in reality, it is a very important step.
Now, Tomasi added that he would like to see money spent more on hospitals, schools, education, rather than the huge amounts invested in weapons of mass destruction.
The United States is one of those countries you mentioned, Juliette, that did not sign the UN treaty that called for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. So did the U.S. take part in the meeting at all?
Yeah, indeed. Most powerful nations in the world didn't put their signatures on the treaty. But that said, the U.S. did send Luis Bono, their deputy ambassador to the Holy See. He sent him to the conference, and he told journalists that he was there because the U.S. is interested to hear what the Holy See is saying about nuclear disarmament. And meanwhile, Russia also sent an ambassador and a top nuclear expert, but China and North Korea didn't attend, despite being invited. And Wyatt, as we know, neither country has relations with the Holy See.
Tell us about the timing of this conference. It coincides with President Trump's trip to Asia and mounting tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Was that intentional?
Yeah, so Cardinal Peter Turkson, who was amongst the organizers, actually drew laughs from the audience when he said that it was perhaps divine providence that the conference coincided with President Trump's Asia trip. Well, the timing was actually a coincidence, Wyatt, and the Cardinal confirmed that the meeting was planned long before the White House announced President Trump's agenda for this trip.
Very interesting. Well, I know that the Vatican has been talking about the issue of nuclear weapons for a while now. It's good to see them continuing to engage on the issue. Juliette Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Coming up, help for the Virgin Islands. A Catholic leader in the region seeks aid on Capitol Hill after the devastation from this year's hurricane season. And National Vocation Awareness Week. We'll talk to the Vocations director from one diocese that's seen a spike in seminarians. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. Many parishes in the Diocese of St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands are still rebuilding after they were hit by 2 hurricanes in September. The storms destroyed a convent, damaged the roofs of a church, 2 rectories, and a parish center, took out the doors and windows of another parish center, and badly damaged a series of parish-owned trailers. There were no injuries to the religious communities, but rebuilding will take a long time. Joining us now is Bishop Herbert Bevard of the Diocese of St. Thomas and the Virgin Islands, which serves the islands of St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix, all islands that felt the effects of Hurricane Irma and Maria. So, Your Excellency, you are here in town meeting with lawmakers in Congress and throughout the week. Tell me a little bit about the progress you've been making, if any.
Well, Wyatt, I think we've made very good progress. We met with officials from the House and from the Senate, from the White House, and they were very interested, very sympathetic, and I think very sincerely interested in doing everything they can to help the territories of the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico.
Well, it's clear that I've been reading about your diocese and all of the damage. It's clear that it has endured some serious damage. I was reading about the top floor, for example, of the rectory of Saints Peter's and Paul Cathedral was blown away. The main convent building of the Missionary Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in St. Croix was completely destroyed. How are Catholic communities on the islands recovering?
Well, it's a process of recovery, first psychologically and spiritually, and I think they are recovering well in that dimension. Physically, of course, it's more difficult. I know that with the help of God and with so many good people and with the help of insurance, those structures will be restored, along with some damage to parishes, to rectories and churches. But maybe more significantly is that the hurricane also destroyed many people's livelihoods in the Virgin Islands. Many people will not get paychecks for a long, long time because we're so dependent upon tourism. And tourism, of course, has suffered a tremendous blow, and it will take a while to recover.
So then what do you say, how do you counsel the faithful who may have been devastated or feeling those effects after the hurricane?
Well, naturally, I counsel them to put their confidence in Almighty God. They're still living. They're still enjoying the gift of life and faith, which are two essential parts of the human experience. And I counsel them to be patient and to look forward to a day of healing and a day when the sun comes out and stays out.
Sure. Prayer, patience, and positivity, all good things, and note that we will be praying for your diocese as well. Bishop Herbert Bevert of the Catholic Diocese of St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wyatt, very much.
The only Catholic university in Oklahoma will close next month. St. Gregory's University in Shawnee was established as a private liberal arts school in 1875. Officials say the decision comes after the school was denied a $12.5 million loan from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. An Ohio seminary is expanding due to record numbers.
This building is about the future. It's about vision, trust, courage, and most of all, it's about faith.
Father Benedicto Kinsella is director of Mount St. Mary's Seminary of the West in Cincinnati, Ohio. Last week, the school broke ground on a new building to add 30 additional seminarians. And this is Vocations Awareness Week, and Lauren Ashburn recently learned more about the rise in the number of seminarians.
Joining us now is Father Dan Schmidt Meyer, Director of Vocations at the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Lauren. Happy to be with you.
That groundbreaking is quite something. This year's class is the largest in 36 years with 82 men. How are you attracting more vocations than others?
I wish I could take credit for it, Lauren, but I know it's not me. We're praying. We're asking God to help us. Archbishop Schmidt, the Archbishop of Cincinnati, wrote this beautiful vocation prayer about 8 years ago. He asked all of the parishes to pray it, and they have been.
Oh, that's absolutely wonderful news. We know that in the United States right now, there are about 26,000 diocesan priests. And in 1965, that number was 38,000. What advice do you have to other seminaries to attract vocations?
Right. The key with vocations is we have to start with prayer. We have to start with the Lord. We have to ask the Master of the Harvest to send out laborers for the harvest. When I first got this assignment as vocation director, I wasn't real happy about it. I'd been a pastor and I loved being a pastor. And the Archbishop said, in a year you'll be vocation director. And I went into prayer and I asked God, what do you want me to do? How do you want me to do this? And I was overwhelmed because in the back of my mind, I'm always just a simple farm boy who's humbled to stand at the altar of Jesus Christ. And usually I don't hear God very clearly in prayer, but this time it was very clear that I had to do a holy hour every day. And I had to get into every parish and school that I could to talk about vocations, and all vocations, not vocations to the priesthood, but also to married life, chaste single life, consecrated life, and the diaconate, and talk about the joys that those vocations bring us.
What do you tell the young people about a vocation? Tell me what you say to them that gets them interested in becoming a priest.
What's amazed me is as I talk with these young people, these young men who are thinking about priesthood or religious life, and the young women looking at religious life, they're all telling me the same thing. They want to be heroes. They want to live a life radically different than the life God called them to live.
Not basketball player heroes, not football player heroes.
Right, heroes. They want to be saints. They want to live this great life and show other people that God loves them.
Wonderful. Father Dan Schmidt Meyer, Director of Vocations at the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren. God bless.
You too.
Up next, helping our veterans. One lawmaker who's also a vet is working on legislation to help those who serve our country. And a visit to the Beijing Zoo. First Lady Melania Trump does a little sightseeing in China before heading back to the United States. Today, the church honors St. Leo the Great on his feast day. He was born in the year 400 in Tuscany, Italy. Leo was elected pope in 440. In 2008, Pope Benedict XVI called his pontificate one of the most important in the church's history. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. As we prepare to celebrate Veterans Day tomorrow, one lawmaker who's a vet himself tells our Lauren Ashburn that he's found a way to help service members deal with the many challenges they face.
We have 22 veterans committing suicide every day. Not all of that, but many of those suicides are linked to post-traumatic stress. And the VA has a certain system where they provide counseling and usually a lot of prescription medication. That roadmap has not worked for all veterans. And so what we have found is when those veterans suffering from acute PTS are linked with specially trained service dogs who are trained to understand the symptoms and to help the veteran mitigate the symptoms of PTS, that these veterans have improved their lives and have gone back to school or gotten gainful employment. And I've had a number of them come up to me say, you know what, if I hadn't got my service dog, I probably would have committed suicide. So this is something that the VA needs to recognize. And so what my bill says is, after a veteran suffering from PTS goes through the VA process, counseling, prescription medication, whatever the VA does, if they're still symptomatic, then let's let the VA work with some of these accredited service dog training groups and pair veterans who are suffering from acute PTS with a specially trained service dog. I am convinced it will save lives, and I think the American people think, hey, we got to do all we can for these veterans, particularly our Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, many of whom have deployed 3, 4, 5, 6 times over the last 10 or 15 years.
The Vatican Gardens adds a taste of Paraguay. A mosaic was dedicated yesterday to Our Lady of Miracles of Pacupe. The country's president and bishops attended the ceremony. Pope Francis visited the Marian Shrine during his trip to Paraguay in 2015. Finally tonight, First Lady Melania Trump is having some fun while overseas. The First Lady greeted children at the Beijing Zoo this morning. She also visited with the zoo's giant panda, Juju. Melania Trump also toured the famed Great Wall of China. President Trump continues his Asia trip, and the First Lady is returning to Washington. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching this week. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Before we go, we want to thank all of the veterans who have served our nation around the world, and we wish everyone a happy Veterans Day weekend. Good night, and God bless.